Welcome to Military Analytics. The Ukrainian armed forces achieved significant success in local counterattacks northwest of Bakhmut. This victory, which came with the withdrawal of Russian troops on the southern coast of the Bakhmut region, was a turning point that altered the course of the war in favor of the Ukrainian army. Images shared by a number of Russian mil bloggers visually confirmed claims that Ukrainian forces are making gains in the area northwest of Bakhmut between Bohdanivka and Verkhovka. According to Russian military bloggers, elements of the 200th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian 14th Corps lost their positions in the area between Heroica and Dubova-Vasilivka, about 6 kilometers northwest of Bakhmut. In addition, Ukrainian troops counterattacked Kromov, Borovivka, and Kishka. Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is active in the region, reported that Ukrainian forces approached Barvivka, and that the Ukrainian army strengthened its positions 500 meters from the northwestern city limits of Bakhmut. However, the Russian Ministry of Defense rejected the claims of other Russian sources regarding the Ukrainian advance, and instead claimed that elements of the 4th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 200th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade repelled all attacks in the Markiivka area. Although the Russian defense minister denied this news, Prigozhin's rhetoric confirmed that the Ukrainian army had made significant gains in Bakhmut and contradicted the Russian defense ministry. After successful offensive operations by the Ukrainian army this week, the Russian military allegedly carried out explosive provocations to justify their temporary flight from Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory and the announcements of evacuation. So, is the Russian army close to defeat at Bakhmut? Recently, the news from Bakhmut is not very encouraging for the Russian army. According to Wagner commander Yevgeny Prigozhin, the boss of the pro-Kremlin mercenary group Wagner, Russian troops fled to the flanks around Bakhmut. Commander Prigozhin claimed that the Russian Ministry of Defense lied a bit after claiming that a Ukrainian offensive had been repelled near Bakhmut before Moscow troops regrouped at a new position with favorable conditions. Russian forces control most of Bakhmut, but Ukrainian troops still hold out in the western parts of the Donbass city and have launched counterattacks from the flanks. Despite its limited strategic value, Bakhmut has developed enormous symbolic significance for both sides and has become a potential target for a long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive. Recently, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that an attack by Ukraine in the vicinity of Soledar, directly north of Bakhmut, was repelled on the tactical front. Soledar. Ukrainian troops carried out offensive actions of more than 95 kilometers along the entire battle line. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement, units of the armed forces of Ukraine carried out 26 attacks, which included more than 1,000 soldiers, up to 40 tanks, other military and special equipment. All attacks of units of the armed forces of Ukraine were repelled. No progress was made. Russian troops were allowed to defend on the Mariinivka front to increase the stability of the defense. The troops of the southern group of Russian troops took control of the border. Taking into account the favorable conditions of the Verkhovka reservoir, however, Commander Prigozhin strongly objected to this version of events, claiming that the gains of Ukraine could lead to the gradual encirclement of Bakhmut, stating that Russia's months-long advance has been reversed. Commander Prigozhin said the entire operation from the west to Bakhmut has been going on for 7 months. During this time, we took the Bear Creek Reservoir, specifically the settlements of Markiivka, and proceeded along the Bakhmut-Sloviansk road in the direction of Sloviansk. Now the opposite is happening. After transferring the wings, there was no tactical retreat. The Russian Defense Ministry lied a little, to put it mildly. The Russian troops just fled from the flanks, he said. Commander Prigozhin has been increasingly outspoken in his criticisms of top Russian military figures, including Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov. Earlier this month, Commander Prigozhin said Wagner would be withdrawing from Bakhmut and blamed the Ministry of Defense for this, but later reversed that stance after more supplies were promised. Last week, Commander Prigozhin, nicknamed Putin's chief, insisted that Bakhmut would be taken. The Ukrainian defenders also praised and commented that the enemy is well-equipped, well-trained, coordinated, and resists with dignity. So we continue on our way. Everything shines. It burns. Russia resorts to all kinds of black propaganda to cover up the losses of the Ukrainian war. One of the most obvious examples of this came from Prigozhin again recently, according to Ukrainian officials. Wagner Group is bragging about the death of a U.S. citizen in Bakhmut who volunteered to fight for Ukraine. In a video posted to social media by Wagner over the weekend, Wagner Group founder Yevgeny Prigozhin appears to be standing over the corpse of former U.S. Army Green Beret Nicholas Mamer as he examines documents. Officials said Mamer's uncle Paul Mamer and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Perry Blackburn, who helped enlist him in Boise, Idaho, confirmed the identity of the body in the video. Ukrainian officials said the video was proof that Wagner incited violence using widely shared graphic video footage. Commander Prigozhin's video highlights that Wagner constantly promotes brutality and glorifies war because the video shows Wagner bragging about the death of a U.S. citizen. Mamer was reportedly killed when a Russian artillery shell hit a building where he was stationed in Bakhmut for most of the war. Mamer's uncle Paul Mamer said he was providing first-hand training in that area so they could continue the war, and he was behind enemy lines. "It's so cruel that Nick died there," he said. Paul Mamer also stated that his nephew died at the age of 45 and had a good life. He joined the struggle in Ukraine for humanitarian reasons and hoped that a veteran's funeral would be held for his nephew. His family is trying to get Mamer to the U.S. for a proper burial. His family thinks Mamer deserves to be buried at the Veterans Cemetery. Mamer did not fight for the United States but because he believed in the freedom of Ukraine. He was fighting to defend his own truth. So what does the U.S. think about this issue? The U.S. Department of State has not officially confirmed Mamer's death. However, a U.S. official said the ministry is seeking additional information and is aware of reports of the death of a U.S. citizen in Bakhmut. It was also revealed by Ukrainian authorities that a few weeks after Mamer arrived in Ukraine, he told the officials of his unit that he was preparing a training program for the Ukrainian military that he hoped would help save some lives. Subsequently, the U.S. Department warned U.S. citizens not to travel to Ukraine because of the war, and urged the remaining U.S. citizens to leave Ukraine immediately if it was safe to do so using any other commercial or privately available ground transportation options. Prigozhin is making a video proudly of this and making the death of the U.S. soldier a propaganda material, which can, of course, be considered as a method used to cover up the bad course of the Bakhmut war on behalf of Russia. The winds of the war in Ukraine continue to blow on Russian soil. One of Putin's biggest fears was that the war he started would spread to his own country. The effects of the Ukrainian war are felt more and more in the depths of Russia. The Kiev fighters seem determined to carry their successes on the front lines to the Russian border. Since the beginning of the war, Ukrainian forces have repeatedly conducted offensive operations against Russian cities close to the border lines. These included cities such as Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod, especially Bryansk, which is located at the westernmost tip of Russia and shares a border with the northeastern tip of Ukraine, is at the focal point of the attacks. Cases of treason and espionage are on the rise in Russia. Moscow tightens its laws against sabotage, but measures have been failing to stop a large number of attacks in recent weeks. Explosions that derailed trains, cut power lines, and mysterious fires. The increased sabotage actions in Russia this week overshadow the preparations for the May 9th World War II Victory Day, the most important celebration of Moscow. President Vladimir Putin has sought to portray Russia as a safe and stable country, as soldiers have been fighting in Ukraine for over a year, and the death toll has risen. Russian officials tried to recruit more men to replenish the weakened ranks. Authorities tried to reassure those at home that the conflict was distant and did not pose a threat to Russian soil. However, a series of explosions in recent days reminded that Russia was also exposed to enemy blows even hundreds of kilometers away from the Ukrainian front. Let's dive into the details of the explosions in Russian cities. Local authorities reported that an explosion occurred for the second time in 2 days after a freight train derailed in the Bryansk region on the border with Ukraine. Regional Governor Alexander Bogomazov stated that an explosive device exploded near the train station in Znamenskaya, about 96 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Bogomazov stated that the explosion did not cause any death or injury. In the statement made by the train operator Russian Railways, it was reported that a locomotive and about 20 wagons were derailed. Russian Railways stated that about 100 meters of railway tracks should be replaced about 330 ft immediately after the explosions. A fire train was dispatched to the scene. However, the first videos of the train derailed on the internet did not show any flames. It was not immediately clear what the train was carrying. The governor made no specific charges for the explosion in which two trains derailed. Kyiv maintains an overall policy of strategic uncertainty regarding attacks on Russian territory. Ukraine also did not take responsibility for the explosions. The previous derailment occurred as a freight train from Belarus passed through the Bryansk region near the town of Wagner, about 96 kilometers east of the Ukrainian border. The explosion was the last blatant sabotage attack to occur in Russia. 8 of the train's 78 cars were derailed after an explosive device was detonated. The derailed wagon caught fire, closing the traffic on the line. Ribber, an influential pro-war Russian military blog, posted a video on Telegram showing cars burning. Ribber noted that the wagons carried petroleum products and timber. Explosions in Russian cities are incessant. Earlier this week, another explosive device damaged power lines in a forest south of St. Petersburg. The FSB security service described it as an act of sabotage. In addition, in the last 5 days, 2 fuel tanks caught fire in and around the Crimean Peninsula. A Russian official reported that an oil depot near the strategically important Kerch Strait Bridge, which connects Russia with Crimea, burned down in the early hours. Veniamin Kondratiev, the governor of the Krasnodar region, said on his Telegram channel that an oil storage tank caught fire in the village of Volna, near the port of Taman. Volna is Russia's only land link with the illegally annexed peninsula of Crimea. Volna is located near the Kerch Strait Bridge, an important supply route for Russian forces amid the ongoing war in Ukraine. The latest fire came days after Russia blamed Ukraine for another fire at an oil depot in the port of Sevastopol. The fire started around 2:30 am. Moscow time. It was claimed that the fire was caused by an unmanned aerial vehicle belonging to Kyiv. Videos of the fire spread rapidly. Leon, Russian and Ukrainian social media video footage showed a large flame and a large black smoke rising into the sky. Anton Gerashenko, one of the advisors of the Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, shared a 28-second video on social media platforms. Gerashenko suggested that the fire may have been part of Ukraine's preparations for the upcoming offensive. Gerashenko stated that weakening Russia's logistics is important for counterattack operations. Alexei Oreskovich, who served as an advisor to the Ukrainian presidency until he resigned in January, claimed earlier this week that Kyiv's counterattack would target the Kerch Bridge. The days in Crimea never returned to normal. Explosions and fires raised tensions in Crimea. Every minute before the explosions in the village of Volna, the port city in Crimea was also shaken by a series of explosions. The oil storage facility, with a capacity of 40,000 tons in the city of Sevastopol, was hit by unmanned aerial vehicles. A bright explosion turned night into day in Sevastopol, then darkened the sky as a Russian fuel tank burned during the day after a Ukrainian drone strike. The reported kamikaze drone attacks set several fuel storage tanks on fire at a large fuel terminal at the western end of Sevastopol. The complex in Kazanka Bay formed a rising cloud of black smoke before it burned, leaving behind charred tanks and pipelines. Moscow's appointed governor of Crimea, Mikhail Rostovtsev, made a statement on his Telegram account stating that 2 drones caused the fire. Preliminary information from the TASS news agency reported that the fire covered approximately 21,500 ft. According to Vasilyev, there were 60 firefighters trying to control the fire. However, the fire was brought under control about 14 hours after it started. Governor Rostovtsev also stated that no one was injured and those living nearby would not be evacuated. Roswellashev added that the fire will not affect the refueling situation in Sevastopol. Also, video from a drone used to investigate damage to the facility shows multiple fuel tanks being completely destroyed. In the images, it's observed that some tanks that do not burn themselves have serious thermal damage. The damage appears significant and likely jeopardizes plant operations in the near future. Whatever the potential impact on operations, no Russian supply officer would want so much fuel and infrastructure to evaporate. The problem is not the fuel lost but the loss of the ability to conserve large amounts of fuel in the future. The Ukrainian armed forces announced in a statement that the attack on an oil reserve in the Russian annexed region of Crimea is part of preparations for the upcoming spring counteroffensive. On the other hand, Ukraine can counterattack at any moment considering this possibility. Russia is increasing its measures in addition to strengthening its defense lines. Moscow is canceling its important celebrations. The May 9th parades have also been cancelled in more remote Russian regions outside of major cities near the Ukrainian border. For now, the main parade on Red Square in Moscow will still continue. The main challenge for the authorities is to ensure that everything goes smoothly. The parade, broadcast all over Russia and demonstrating the military might of Moscow, is the main event of the year and is crucial to Putin's legitimacy. The parade often gathers crowds who come to watch the tanks and soldiers marching through Moscow with their families. Since coming to power in 2000, Putin has promoted a cult of patriotism that was used to fuel patriotism around the Soviet victory over the Nazis in 1945 and boost his legitimacy as the heir to Soviet power. It seems that Ukraine's offensive operations have not only affected Russian cities. These operations also undermine the prestige of the Russian leader. Russia threatens Britain with a major embargo. The Kremlin spokesperson has taken action to impose heavy embargoes on Britain. Britain's critical Storm Shadow move drove Putin crazy when the Ukrainian army carried out 2 successful operations with these missiles. Putin's fear of losing Crimea gripped him. He decided to send 400 troops to Crimea to stop the British Storm Shadows. This confused the whole world. In the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Britain's actions took another turn. The UK, which has been in a decisive position by providing different kinds of support in every aspect of the war, took a very different step. This time it decided to send Storm Shadow missiles with a range of 250 kilometers to Ukraine. This decision put Moscow in range, and Putin went berserk. Putin's embassy in the UK posted a very harsh statement when he stated that the British people, the taxpayers, were forced into this war. The reactions to the Russian Council came one after another. This once again proved to the world that the British people, like the UK, are in full support of Ukraine. But the Council's real reaction was that the missiles sent to Ukraine had become the central figure in 2 successful operations in the Don Blast. Ukraine blew up one of the buildings occupied by the Russians. This showed the world how far Ukraine's dominance in this region has expanded. But the real success came when Ukrainian leader Zelensky used a different strategy of surprise to deal the biggest blow to Russian troops as he continued his summit tour in London. According to the Daily Express, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked the UK for its contribution at the end of his talks with Rishi Sunak. He said that Russia would be dealt a very strong blow. Immediately after this statement, Storm Shadows were mobilized by the Ukrainian army, and 2 Russian fighter jets and 2 military helicopters were shot down. Putin, who was very angry at this, brought forward the Kremlin spokesman and reminded Boris of the words, "We will destroy England with a single missile." After this, Putin realized that Ukraine could gain superiority whenever it wanted thanks to Storm Shadows, and he made a critical decision. Putin was aware that Ukraine was sensitive about Crimea from the beginning of the war. It was only a matter of time before Zelensky, who risked everything to dominate this region, hit the Russian military headquarters in Crimea with its Storm Shadows. Realizing this, Putin immediately took action to deploy S-400s in Crimea. This step marked the end of Putin's dominance in the Black Sea. When British intelligence informed Ukraine about this information, Putin was on a very difficult path. While Putin was thinking about where he could send the androids to Crimea, he thought that overland supply would not be safe enough after Ukraine's successful operation at the Kerch Bridge. Therefore, he decided to send the S-400s onwards to Crimea by sea. Russia was expected to completely block Ukraine's path with intensive security measures. But when the Ukrainian military got wind of this clandestine shipment, they took action to intercept the Russian ships before they approached the port of Sevastopol. And they made their preparations in the region as if they asked for hundreds were going to activate. At this point, another critical weapon purchased from the UK was activated and the Russian troops were caught off guard. The signal jamming submarine sent by the UK came into play at this point. They started to wait under the coordinates where the Russian ships would be attacked. The Ukrainian army also brought its armed drones to the nearby airport to direct them to this area for a comfortable operation. And British intelligence informed the Ukrainian military that the Russian Navy was heading towards the region. This was enough to start the operation. The Bayraktars in the region took off and moved towards the coordinates just in time for the calculations to be activated. Ukrainian drones and the Russian Navy came face to face. The Russian Navy was overconfident, thinking that with the S-400s at its side, It could block all airstrikes. But Britain's submarine jammers changed everything. The S-400, which wanted to fire at Ukrainian drones, started to miss the target. The armed drones, which easily dodged the missiles swerving left and right, turned the tide in their favor. These developments shocked the soldiers in the Russian Navy. The S-400s were a huge embarrassment. Ukrainian drones started bombarding, but when the heavily protected ships could not be sufficiently damaged, the British missile system, Storm Shadow, became decisive for this operation as well. Storm Shadows, which were kept ready near Odessa, were fired one after the other towards the coordinates where these ships were located. The Russian navies were anchored for the correct operation of the S-400s. As a result of the Ukrainian army firing missiles one after the other, things completely turned in favor of Ukraine. The Russian ships were hit from Odessa with pinpoint strikes. 3 ships were buried at the bottom of the sea, along with the S-400s. The drones that successfully returned from the operation were welcomed at the airport. After the successes of the Ukrainian soldiers, huge celebrations took place in Odessa, realizing that the ships carrying S-400s had not arrived in Sevastopol. Russian soldiers began to panic, realizing that there was a big problem with the explosions coming from nearby. Russian soldiers immediately informed the Kremlin. Putin was furious when he learned that the S-400s had been blown up. He once again issued a warning to the UK, which supplied the Storm Shadows, the main figure in this operation that made the Russian army and air defense systems look incapable. But this time the warning was not verbal. It sent its name and a large group of troops to the Baltics to be close to Britain. This development was recorded as an intimidation against many countries supporting the Ukrainian army. But the response to the step was not delayed. Before the UK, a very big threat came from Finland, one of the biggest powers in that region. This made both Russian forces and Putin's hair stand on end. The Finnish chief of staff said that Russia is playing with fire in this region. He said that if this continues, Russia should prepare itself for a very big war. Having received such a threatening response even from the Baltics, it is only a matter of time before Putin faces even bigger problems. While it is becoming more and more difficult for Russia to breathe in these regions, the comments made by analysts about the developments here resonated all over the world. According to law analysts, the Ukrainian army is gradually achieving success. The main reason for this was that many countries in the West were supporting it in every sense. Russian soldiers are demoralized by these major failures against Ukraine and are trying to continue their struggle on the front line. Aware of this, Putin has said in his recent speeches that Russia's fate depends on the course of the war in Ukraine. If such problems continue, Ukraine is expected to end the war in a very short time. But at this point, not only a major defeat awaits Russia, but also a major political crisis. If things continue like this, the Ukrainian army will win the biggest victory in its history. And for the first time in Russia, the possibility of early elections will be strengthened. Vladimir Putin has ruled Russia for nearly 30 years. The Russian people are fed up with the repressive regimes during this period of rule. It is completely forbidden to speak against the government in Russia in the wake of such troubles and defeats against Ukraine. There has been a huge change in Russia. While many of Putin's alternatives have come to the fore in Russia, Putin, in response to this, has sacrificed a large number of people since he has eliminated all the bureaucrats and commanders who could jeopardize his power. IQ is not expected from the Russian military. The dismissal of a large number of soldiers who fought against the Ukrainian army has made things more complicated. This has been recorded as the price of being weak against Ukraine, and the defeat of the Russian army in a short period of time is expected to return to Putin as a resignation.